So Francesca, welcome. It's our pleasure to have you with us today. Your vast experience in political transitions and women's participation in political processes will greatly enrich our discussion today. So just before we go into our discussion, I will speak a few words about today's webinar, which is part of Mars's Community Change Partners project. This project, which was initiated in 2022, over 3 phases. This project aims to build a more resilient, cohesive, and secure community by strengthening civil society networks and enhancing local capacities in the whole geography of Syria. Through initiatives like this, like our webinar today, we bring together all the stakeholders to share insights and strategies, promote dialogue, and empower local actors so they have a better role in shaping their community's future. Surely your perspectives will be invaluable as we explore the role of women in political participation and peace building in these challenging contexts. Thank you again for joining us.
Thank you, Miriam, and thank you everyone for taking some of your evening to attend. As Miriam said, I have several years experience in countries in transition, and in particular countries in conflict or post-conflict, such as Bosnia and Herzegovina, also Iraq. I have lived and worked in Palestine and Libya and other Middle East, North Africa countries such as Morocco. And, you know, I have unfortunately never been to Syria. At a time when it was possible to go, they weren't being very friendly to Canadians. So I always had a hard time getting a visa. But it is definitely on my list of places to go.
You will be welcome for sure.
Thank you. But one of the things in post-conflict and conflict societies I find is a commonality, whether it's in the Middle East and North Africa, whether it's in Europe, whether it's in Africa, is that most post-conflict and conflict societies have very patriarchal norms. And, you know, if you look at countries where women's political participation is robust and women participate almost equally within the political institutions, there's very little violence. There's very little political violence. And so there have been studies by people who are much more academic on this that relate conflict and patriarchal communities, including to the success of peace building because of the social expectations and resistance from male leaders. And one of the biggest challenges in post-conflict or even conflict communities is the exclusion from the decision-making process of women. And women are often excluded from formal peace negotiations, from governance, post-conflict rebuilding efforts. And even though that they are disproportionately affected by the conflict, you know, when there is conflict and violence, women tend to, more than men, and we'll go into sort of the issues of security threats and internal displacement, but women are disproportionately affected by the conflict. However, only about 10% of negotiators globally in peace processes are women. And so the exclusion means that peace agreements are not reflecting the priorities or needs of women. And one of the things that I've noticed in the different countries is people often put together ending the conflict and the peace building. And while ending conflict is a very urgent need, and it usually involves men because they're the ones fighting and they're the ones that started the conflict. it is different than peace building. Peace building is a process. So ending the conflict, while there is an urgency to that, peace building should be developing new institutions, should be making sure that it's more inclusive. And for instance, in Bosnia and Herzegovina, the conflict was ended by the Dayton Peace Accords in 1995. And it was negotiated by those people that were involved in the conflict, and the United States brokered the deal. But the Dayton Peace Accords also included a new constitution for Bosnia and Herzegovina. Now, a constitution is something that requires reflection and process and inclusion of different voices and different people, not something to be developed in the urgency of ending conflict. And so I think that we need to start looking at separating ending the violence and ending the conflict. And certainly women should be involved in that process as well. But then looking at the peace building process. And later on, when we talk about opportunities, I'll have a couple of examples of how women have been engaged in peacemaking that is more thoughtful and that is being that people have taken their time to do. Because I think when you take your time to engage in peace negotiations, you can be more inclusive. And we know that during conflict, women, and particularly women activists, women's NGOs, are very much involved at the local level. You know, they may not get a seat at the table on the big negotiation side, but they're often involved in negotiating the community disputes, bringing together people within the community. They are often working with patriarchal structures such as sheikhs or clan leaders to bring together people within their community to be able to provide the necessities that families and children and communities need during conflict, like healthcare, like food, safety. So women are involved in negotiating and implementing conflict-related activities to mitigate conflict within their communities. So they should be therefore involved at the bigger level. So that's one of the first challenges that I see, is the exclusion from the decision-making process. You know, even though we have Resolution 1325 and there's always people who are saying that we need more women at the table, but we also should look at women at the local level and the activists, and then lift those activists up to a national negotiation process. Miriam, did you want me to go on to the next challenge?
Yes, sure. Whatever works for you. It's just that maybe if I have some question related to the part that you mentioned, and I pose my question now, I think we keep the ideas connected better, maybe. So speaking of which, when you talked about the exclusion of women, we understand that this is not merely a matter of political will, but also is a reflection of structural issues. How do you think that deeply rooted institutional biases within political systems and peace mechanisms contribute to women's marginalization? This is for one part of the question. Mm-hmm. If you like, maybe you can answer this and then we move to the second part.
Yeah, I mean, as I said, it's a reflection of the society as a whole, and many societies where there is conflict are patriarchal, and they exclude women even when there's not conflict. So they exclude them from decision-making processes, whether it's political, whether it's at the in the economic sphere. You know, women And this is particularly difficult for women in conflict because if they have traditionally been excluded from developing skills, from having economic agency, then when they are suddenly the head of a household because the conflict has taken away the men in their families, they are even more vulnerable. So it's a patriarchal institutional system that excludes women in many communities, and that's why they don't think to include women in the negotiation process.
Okay, thank you very much. Please, maybe you can continue also with the second challenge, and maybe I will share with you, not in the Q&A questions, but maybe I can share with you some of our audience's written insights while we speak. So please go ahead.
That's great, thanks.
Yeah.
The second, and it's obvious, but the second challenge is very real security threats and violence. Women leaders and activists in conflict zones face threats to their safety, including being targeted. As I said, women in a conflict are usually on the front line. They're usually providing humanitarian assistance. They're usually providing support to communities, but that makes them vulnerable, and they face threats to their safety. They face harassment. They face intimidation. You just need to look at someone like Nadia Murad, who I think everybody would know, the Yazidi activist. After she survived her ISIS captivity, she became a very strong voice and advocate for Yazidi women and sexual violence survivors. And to this day, she continues to receive harassment and threats. And so women activists need to help each other and understand that there are real threats to their security during conflict and also in post-conflict situations. And unfortunately, the fear of retaliation can silence women and prevent them from participating in rebuilding their communities. And particularly when, women are facing resistance outside of conflict, during a conflict, the incidence of sexual violence is very well known, and harassment. And this just makes many, many women say, I'm not going to put my head up. I'm not going to do anything to help in my community. And it really does have an impact on women's activities. I have a few different examples when we talk about opportunities of the way in which women's groups and activists have helped and provided security and safety to women in conflict. But I don't want this to be all one way, so if there's some comments or questions.
Okay. So basically, when we're talking about the violence, which is considered one of the most prominent challenges and barriers women face, especially in contexts which are harsh, like the contexts that you worked at or the ones where we might be facing in Syria. But this violence against women is often normalized in fragile states. How do you think that this normalization perpetuates the cycle of women's exclusion from political spaces? And what does it mean for long-term peace and stability, since we are talking that peace building is a long process?
Yeah, I mean, as I said, one of the impacts is that women are intimidated into not participating. So I think that the normalization of violence against women, whether it's sexual violence or other violence, prevents and intimidates women, not just in conflict, but in many societies. I've done a lot of work on violence against women in politics, in non-conflict communities, and thankfully, UN Women is changing their definition now. They're broadening it. And, when women are excluded from meetings, that they should be told about or invited to in order to do their job as a member of parliament, that is a form of violence. That is a form of harassment. So I think we have to unnormalize violence, and it starts also with male partners and with male allies, champions within the communities, and there are in many communities these champions. But we have to unnormalize it. We have to talk about it. I was quite fascinated during COVID. Around the world, the rates of gender-based violence increased because women were stuck at home with abusers, and they had no way to go out. They couldn't even go to shelters, and you know, people developed very creative ways of, you know, when they were on a video call, there were all kinds of hand gestures that women could make, and that they could be communicating to other people that they were in trouble. And I think the more we speak about it, the more we unnormalize it, because, you know, men have wives and children and daughters and mothers and sisters, and some men are embarrassed to talk about sexual violence and violence against women. But we shouldn't be. We shouldn't be embarrassed to talk about it. We shouldn't say this is a family matter. And I've lived in many communities where people have said, no, this is, you know, to deal with the family. And we just have to keep talking about it.
Yes, I also agree with the part related to the rates of domestic violence when the lockdown was in the COVID time. Maybe there will be also a question, but this one is drawing from your experience in the Balkans, your work there. I mean, we talked about the gender-based violence. We talked about the structural systems within the communities which hinders and hampers women's political participation. But drawing from your experience in the Balkans, how do ethnic, sectarian, and tribal divisions complicate the inclusion of women in peace-building processes? I'm specifically asking this question because we feel that this is the context that is really related to Syria's. There's kind of resemblance between the context that you have been working at in Balkans and in Syria in more way or another. So how do you think this type of challenges might contribute to hindering the women's role in political participation?
Yeah, it's also, I've also worked in Iraq, where there are very similar sectarian divisions, right? So, and it really is, I find that women are the first to break them down, but when a conflict is started or sustained on the backs of sectarian division, it's very hard for women to not follow that. You know, are they Bosnian Muslim or Bosnian Serb or Bosnian Christian before they are a female activist? But I do find that they are active within their own communities, and I think that's where it starts. It has to start where they're active in their own communities and get that strength and experience and the skills to then start reaching out to other women. And again, it happens more at the local level to begin with, where, you know, women will reach out across, maybe have a meeting. Sometimes it needs to be facilitated by a sort of independent third party. But when I was in Bosnia, they had right after the conflict, they had a policy of separate schools. And so the Muslims went to school on one day or in the mornings, and then the Serbs went to school in the afternoons. And there's a city called Brčko, which is in the north, and they decided to integrate. And they had a school where every kid would go to school regardless of what religion they were. And this mother was telling me that her child came after the first day of school and said, but mommy, they look just like me. You know, so we tend to, and this is part of the problem with prolonged conflict, is those sectarian divides are deeper. And, you know, in Bosnia before the war, there was intermarriage, and, you know, nobody cared what religion someone was. When it became a sectarian conflict, then an entire generation has grown up believing that that sectarian division is important. And it takes a lot of reconciliation. I'm not a reconciliation expert, and I know that there are many reconciliation workers who spend years breaking down those barriers that the conflict has created. I mean, they are artificial barriers in one way. Because they all do look just like me. You know, we all look the same. We all have the same desires. We all have the same needs. So it takes the longer, in my opinion, a sectarian conflict is maintained, the harder it is to get past that. But it is possible to get past that.
Yes, exactly. It's possible, but it's kind of it's challenging. So, Francesca, I will have 1 minute to remind the audience that they can participate with us vocally by typing one on the chat. I will say this to my audience, so you are aware of what we are talking now. أعزائنا الحضور اللي حابب يعمل مداخلة صوتية بخص هذا المحور فيه يكتب واحد على الشات، يعني هو أسهل من تعقب الأيدي المرفوعة، أو اللي حابب يكتب كمان أسئلته بشكل كتابي على الشات رح ناخدهم إن شاء الله خلال فقرة الأسئلة والأجوبة التي أصبحت قريبة جدا بالنسبة للمحور الأول. طيب. Okay, Francesca, yes, sorry, I just reminded them so they can prepare their questions and comments related to the first axis of challenges. If we want to sum up, let's say, the main or what you see the most significant obstacles preventing women from participating meaningfully in peace-building efforts. I mean, just to arrange them and summarize what we have talked about in this specific axis. Of course, drawing on your experience and with the knowledge that you have about the Syrian context.
Yeah, I do want to talk about one more really important challenge. And that's the internal displacement of families and women. You know, in Bosnia, there was a large refugee, but also an internally displaced population. In places, well, right now we're seeing in Palestine and also in Syria. I know you have
Lebanon as well.
In Lebanon, I know you have a very large internally displaced. And, you know, I think we understand as activists that there's an increased vulnerability to women. You know, women tend to be more displaced than men are. I was reading a statistic about Colombia. The country of Colombia had the second largest portion of its population displaced by the conflict after Syria. Excuse me.
Oh.
And 65% of those were women and girls. So women and girls are more vulnerable to displacement. They're more subject to, more vulnerable to abuse, sexual exploitation. With, you know, with all due respect to the international community that says, and national governments that set up camps, you know, the camps are temporary, they're supposed to be temporary, and they very rarely make women feel safe. And so I think that a priority for internally displaced women is to make sure that they feel safe. But also it disrupts, you know, being displaced disrupts health and reproductive health risks. You know, pregnant women, nursing mothers face higher risks due to lack of care when they're suddenly displaced. The loss of income and livelihood and the increased responsibilities. And this is where, going back to a patriarchal system that typically excludes women from decision-making from the economic sphere, suddenly women are widowed, they are the head of a household, they are the head of their family, and they have no economic power. They have no ability to, they've had no money of their own because they haven't been able to have a bank account, because they haven't been able to work. And so one of the biggest things that I've found working with women who are displaced is the lack of documentation that they have. I mean, women are, you know, when you're displaced, you usually flee very quickly and you go to a new community, and suddenly you want to get a job, you want to get an apartment, you want to enroll your children in school, and you cannot do that because you have no proof of who you are. And that is a terribly shocking thing for someone to go through, in addition to everything else that displacement means. So, you know, it's usually the women's NGOs in different communities that mobilize to help displaced women. And it's just shocking that we're not doing more to support displaced women around the world.
Yes, I agree that the documentation issue is actually one of the consequences that comes with the aftermath. After you flee the war or the conflict and you saved your life, your family, and then this issue comes up to the surface when you need to continue your life and you have this lack of documentation, which actually this was something Syrian people have faced in different contexts after they flee the country.
So it was something in Bosnia, you know, women, when they fled from Srebrenica, they couldn't prove the home ownership. Even if they wanted to go back, which most of them didn't want to go back, but if they didn't, it was very difficult to prove that they owned the home that they had been living in.
Exactly. Yes, I agree, which is really one of the most catastrophic consequences of the conflicts in the post-conflict context, let's say. Okay, so from my side, I think maybe we can say that we have covered the main points of this axis, unless you want to add something, of course. Well, now I'd like maybe to open the floor for the audience's questions and thoughts before we move on to the next segment. So I will ask my colleague Aras to give us the first comment.
نور قرموش إذا بعد إذنك بتعطينا مداخلتك تشيل البيوت.
Thank you so much guys for giving me the opportunity to participate in this amazing pioneer. Thank you so much, Mariam, and thank you so much, Francisca. I'm not going to take this long. I'm going to have more time for my colleagues to ask. So I have a two-part question, if this is possible. First question is of historical context, so I'm going to leave that to the end. So the first part is, how can we ensure the positive and safe participation of women in the peace and decision-making process? And I'm sure that you're following up the latest escalations and latest developments in the Syrian context, and how the complex situation that the Syrian context and the situation has gotten. So how can we ensure the positive impact and the positive participation of these women when the participation itself for all parts of the society is actually, I'm not going to say missing, but not being representative, but not being represented positively by all the society's factors, not only women. So how can we ensure the positive participation of women when even men don't have this type of access, and political life is like 90% missing in the Syrian context? And the second part is, how can you please reflect from your experience, the Syrian situation and compare it to countries with different culture or ethical background. Let's say after the World War I, after Versailles Treaty, how the Nation League was established, and all of these details. So I hope my question was clear.
Well, I'm not sure I can give much of an answer on the second question. I'm not a historian, and while I do follow Syria, I'm not so much of an expert in Syria as I am in other countries. But I think that the participation, after large-scale conflicts like the First World War, the Second World War, so many countries were involved in that I think that there was a willingness by different countries. The problem that I see with conflicts today, the difference is that they are more regional and localized, and people's attention span is not as strong as it should be, and unfortunately, the region right now, the Middle East is burning up, and I think a lot of people are paying attention to it. But when the Syrian conflict started, everyone paid attention, and then attention kind of went off to somewhere else, and so we don't have I don't think we have the ability, and we should get it back, to, as they say in English, walk and chew gum at the same time. We should and can spend time on trying to solve different conflicts. But I think that is a difference from sort of historical, is that it was a world war. And so the world decided to do something. They had the League of Nations after the First World War, and then the United Nations. And just watching the UN General Assembly last week, all these calls at reforming the UN, and I do believe the UN needs reforming. I think that I've been in most countries where I've worked, there has been a UN mission, and sometimes they've been really great, and sometimes you just sort of roll your eyes and think, what are you people doing here? So I think we need a more systematic way for countries to be really included in a global decision-making body in a meaningful way that's meaningful to their countries as well. So if there were, and the problem with bodies like the United Nations is that they have to be official, so they have to talk to the officials. And I know that some of the different agencies, and they do try and include activists and NGOs in different side events and activities, which is great. They should do much more of that. And they should be inclusive in that way and provide people who are activists in one country with the negotiating skills, with the ability to be able to use those skills in a more inclusive, participatory way when it's time. Sometimes it's not time. Sometimes the conflict is at a point where nobody's talking to each other. Not men, not women, nobody's talking to each other. But I have seen, we do a lot of work in Libya, and so I have seen when the situation in Libya is stalled, the women's organizations are still extremely active on the ground. And they are maintaining their communities, and they are talking to each other, and they are making sure that any conflicts in their local communities are mitigated to as much as possible. And so I think that to have meaningful participation, and not just women, but also sectarian minorities and ethnic minorities and disabled rights, this goes back to what I said at the beginning. Negotiating peace is a process. It cannot be done overnight and needs to be inclusive. In Colombia, when the FARC, when they started negotiating peace, it faltered a couple of times, and it will. I mean, something will happen and then everybody gets upset. But when it really started to work, when they had these different commissions, and they had a gender commission, and they said, okay, we may only have 1 or 2 women at the head table, but we've got all these other side tables, and we want the gender commission to tell us what we need to pay attention to. So they were committed to making sure that there was a gender influence, even if, you know, there wasn't a equality around the main negotiating table. They were getting information, and they were empowering a gender perspective in that process. So I think there are creative ways that you can ensure participation. And again, it doesn't necessarily have to be at the table, at the main table. I would like to see equality at the main table. But if there's a process that is inclusive and brings other voices in through the side door, through the back door, you know, then that's a good start.
Thank you, Francisca, for your inclusive answer. And thank you, Noor, again, for your valuable question. I also have some interesting questions from our audience. I will have them, they are written, I will interpret them to you so you can have the chance to answer these important questions. It's just that maybe we need to limit the answers in 3 to 4 minutes, or maybe 5, so we can move smoothly to the next axis. So there's an interesting question actually related to the success stories. Can you mention some of the success stories for women that were involved in the political processes and in peace building within the countries that you have worked in? Do you believe that the reality or the status quo of women in Bosnia and Libya or the Balkans have really become better?
Sorry, has the situation for women become better?
Yes, exactly. In those specific countries, or maybe also in Iraq, I can add this to the question.
No, I think Iraq is going through a bit of a difficult time right now with the proposed personal status amendments to the personal status law. I think generally in Bosnia, yes, there is more participation of women in political institutions, political life. I think that in terms of your first question and examples of how they were involved in peacekeeping, as I said, the actual peace negotiations were very quick, but women have, when Bill Clinton was president, he brought countries together in Bosnia to create these different axes, like economic, peace and security, and I think political. He brought the world together, and everybody agreed that they had to focus to help Bosnia get out of, it was, war had ended, but to sort of move on. And there were no women invited to this. There was no gender component. And there's a great activist from Slovenia, her name is Sonja Lokar, and she just got all of her female friends from the Balkans. And this was not a specific Bosnian issue, it was a Balkan thing. And they all demanded a seat at the table. And these were all activists, political activists, civil society activists from their communities, and made a lot of noise. And then they figured out that different ambassadors were involved in this. So they insisted on meeting with them, and they got what they called the Gender Pact for this overall Balkan Pact. And it is the only part of that process that is still remains today as part of that overall pact. And so sometimes it's just, you just have to keep banging down the door. You know, people aren't going to open it up for you. Sometimes you have to bang it down. And one of my favorite sayings from an American woman is, if they don't give you a seat at the table, bring a folding chair. You know, just be insistent that you are part of the process and part of the negotiations. And then eventually people will get tired of saying no, and they'll start saying yes. Do I think women are better off I think part of it is in Bosnia and Herzegovina, they have gender quotas for parliament and for municipal elections. I didn't used to be a fan of quotas, but I understand that it's important to have those in transition countries. It's, and I hate the 30%. I think we should have 50% quotas and just get it over with. So in places where they have quotas, there are, definitely Rwanda has the best female political participation. 2 reasons: because they had quotas, but also because so many men had died in the conflict that women became politically active.
The main agents for political processes. Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, Francesca, for answering this question, and thank you for shedding light on the numerous challenges women face in peace-building processes. Francesca, while these barriers are significant, they are not impossible to overcome, as we said a little while ago. In fact, many contexts have shown that where there are challenges, there are also opportunities. Let's now shift our focus to explore some of the promising opportunities that can enable women to not only overcome obstacles, but also take on more active and influential roles in political and peace processes. Maybe I can start also with one key question to help us delve more into this detail. And maybe we talk about the digital activism. So the rise of digital activism and social media has opened new avenues for women's political participation. How do you think that Syrian women can leverage these platforms to advocate for peace and build political movements, even in the absence of formal political spaces?
Yeah, I think you're right, Miriam. I'm a little older than you, so I'm still trying to figure out the digital world. But I think there's also a downside to digital activism because it invites harassment and it invites hate speech. And it's something that I know a lot of women politicians. I was having coffee a few months ago when I was back home in Canada with a woman politician, and just the horrible things people say about her and her colleagues is awful. And I know it happens in all countries. So I think we need to understand how we can protect each other on the digital activism. And whether or not, sometimes I've heard of strategies where if someone puts something out there and receives a lot of hate messages, that women go after that and then amplify the positive message. So, it's like having a network, but it's virtual. And as with any organizing, I think the fundamentals of organizing networks in person applied to digital networking and digital activism. The benefit of digital activism is you can reach so many more people. And again, I think it's about understanding the different platforms, and they are different. I treat Facebook and Instagram and Twitter all the same, and I shouldn't, because they have different audiences. No. And educating ourselves on who those audiences are. There are so many people in the international community outside of Syria who are very supportive of women's activism. Engage them in the digital activism, give them, again, people who don't have a great attention span, sometimes you have to feed them something, and it's much easier to do that with, here's a meme, here's a hashtag, and get involved that way and raise the profile of what is happening in your country, whether it be Iraq, whether it be Syria, because people don't always understand that and how they can help. And so I think the power of digital activism is also within your own communities, because then you can feel safe, you can do it safely, but you can also use digital activism to start conversations. What kind of constitution do we want? What kind of parliament do we want? Do we think quotas are the way to go? to increase women's political participation? You know, why aren't women involved in this community as opposed to that community? So it's not just about informing, but it's also about starting those conversations.
Yes, I believe maybe with the right cybersecurity tools, maybe these platforms could really contribute to a new era. I mean, for the digital activism where women can find themselves more secure and they can promote their ideas and their contribution to the political process maybe in more secure way. My next question related to opportunities as well. I wanted to ask about the GAI instrument, which is the Global Acceleration Instrument for Women, Peace and Security. This instrument provides funding for local women's organizations. What do you think a piece of advice that you could give to Syrian women seeking international support without compromising their independence and their own specific values and norms related to their contexts?
Sorry, I'm recovering from a cold, so.
Yeah, no. Get well soon.
What's happened here? Again, using digital media is very helpful in getting attention, right? And it's about showing it's hard to be a small NGO, it's hard to be civil society activists around the world. It really, and I feel for all these people who are doing wonderful things to help their communities. But getting people's attention by showing the good work that you do, you should never, ever you should never compromise your standards, because they say it takes years to build a reputation and 5 minutes to destroy it. So, you know, never compromise your standards. Is this whiteboard? Am I the only one seeing this whiteboard?
No, we're seeing the whiteboard.
Oh,
I think
okay.
it's done by mistake by one of the audience. Maybe they will, my friends in the technical support, they will solve
That's
this.
Okay.
Yeah, just
as long as I'm.
Don't look at the
whiteboard. Not just me.
Okay. Don't look at the whiteboard.
Yeah. But I think also, you know, we work with a lot of NGOs. I think collaboration among NGOs, donors like to see other NGOs working together, and they like to see, and they like innovation. You know, Julia Gillard, the former Prime Minister of Australia, once said, "We spend so much time trying to fix women so that they can fit in. We need to fix the system. Women are fine." And, you know, we spend a lot of time as activists, not just in conflict societies, but trying to train women, you know, empower them. And what are we empowering them to do? You know, women are very powerful. Women can make decisions. You know, women make important decisions every day and they resolve conflict every day. And if they, you know, and they say, well, it's conflict between my children, or I manage my household income, that is just done on a larger scale by men in the parliament. So, you know, we denigrate our own abilities. So women are fine. Women have the skills. We need to be able to provide them with opportunities to be innovative and using those skills to come together in their communities. And, you know, we have done some work in Bangsamoro, which is an autonomous region of the Philippines. And women in Bangsamoro worked with their local communities. And so the autonomous region of Bangsamoro is a Muslim minority, but they are Muslim majority in Bangsamoro, but in Philippines, they're a minority. And they worked with the muftis and the religious leaders in their communities to contribute to the negotiating process. And because there was a national process that looked down to the communities. I mean, it looked down in the sense that it drew from the communities. It wasn't a top-down process. It involved local communities. So I think we need to have creative programming that donors will support that say this community action is important and this is how it feeds into the larger peace process. But you know, I think donors, I think donors are getting tired of just having trainings for the sake of trainings. You know,
Yes.
what are you gonna do with the training? And how is this going to improve your community? Yeah.
Yes, exactly. This is leads us, I think, to the question I was willing to ask. I mean, throughout your experience, but maybe we need to pay more attention to the timing since we have not much left.
Okay.
But the conversation
Yeah.
was really interesting with you, Francesca. I forgot to track the time. So based on your experience and the things that you said now about innovation, what do you think, or have you seen through your work that unconventional strategies have proven really effective in mobilizing women and broader communities around political issues?
Well, I think particularly in conflict communities, I think it's important to document experiences. And, you know, now with social media and digital technology, we have the ability to tell stories much better that reach a large group of people quickly. You know, after the Bosnian War, there was an organization called Medica Zenica in Bosnia that documented the physical sexual violence that women experienced so that it could be used in legal cases, but also so that communities could start healing. Because this goes back to, how do we not normalize sexual violence? Well, we start talking about it and we start documenting it. We start saying, this is what actually happened. And so I think that's important to do. Other things, especially on 125 or 1325, I know that there's a great activist from Erbil in Iraq, Susan Araf. I'm sure some of the audience know who Susan Araf is. She's the head of Women Empowerment Organization. It's a national organization in Iraq, and she's based in Erbil. She started with, the government wasn't producing a national action plan for women, peace, and security. So she got a network together and said, okay, we're going to do the national action plan. And she had some funding from UN Women, and I think, if not at the beginning, then later on. And now the government looks to her to organize the report on the national, and to follow up and monitor whether the National Action Plan for Women, Peace and Security is being implemented. Bosnian women activists did the same thing on CEDAW. CEDAW, the government wasn't producing a report on CEDAW, so they wrote the shadow report. So monitoring the activities of the government, again, get you that international attention and also help with getting, you know, it's something innovative that might attract some donors. And it's concrete. It's like, you know, there are these wonderful international instruments that I don't think we leverage enough. And, you know, I'm not the greatest fan of the United Nations. I've said that right here, but I do think if we have these, we should try and figure out how to leverage these international instruments. And I do think that the international community needs to do a better job at insisting on the participation of women. You know, I'm sure any activist on this call has met with UN officials at some time, or an ambassador. But, you know, when it comes to them being involved in the peace process or negotiating, they don't insist that there be equal number of women at the table. And they should. They should say, look, we're not, and I know that there's an urgency to end the violence, but they're the ones calling the shots many times. And so they should be the ones insisting. In Libya, there was a process that was started by the United Nations, and there was the acting Stephanie, I can't remember her last name. She got together political leaders, and they had all agreed to whatever came out of their process would be their next steps. They didn't agree to it, but she also insisted that there be a certain proportion of women that was meaningful. So when you have international organizations, even, you know, I hate when people come and visit. I'm sure, you know, it's difficult to go visit in Syria to some of these organizations, but they just do the official visits. They just go visit the government or the political leaders. They should visit the NGOs. They should visit women's activists and get their perspective. And that doesn't happen enough. And so we need to leverage the role of the international community.
Yes, exactly. Inspecting or investigating the true local status quo is what really matters. So I think we concluded now the main points related to this axis. I'm checking the audience written questions, and I tend to feel that they are more related to the third axis, which is related to strategies. So maybe we can wrap up with this axis and move directly to the next one. And there we can double maybe the amount of questions asked or taken. So it's clear that while there are numerous opportunities for women to be more engaged, this alone are not enough. So without effective strategies to navigate the political landscape and address the underlying barriers, these opportunities might remain out of reach. Maybe now let's delve more into some practical strategies that have proven successful overcoming these barriers and ensuring that women can fully participate and lead in political process. I know it's kind of general and large question to be answered, but maybe I can start with what really directs the political participation for women one way or another, which are the UNSCR 1325. And of course, its subsequent resolutions, 1820, 1888, 2242. Those resolutions emphasis on women's participation in peace and security, yet implementation remains a challenge. How do you think that local women groups actually can leverage these resolutions to advocate for their rights, to be in the rightful place in the peace building process?
Well, as I said, I mean, you can sort of take a page out of the Book of Iraq and do a report yourself and monitor the implementation of UN 1325 in Syria, and, you know, make sure you publicize it and send it to the UN and say, you know, nobody's doing this, so we're going to do this. We are going to draft a national action plan, get in touch with UN Women and ask them to help draft a national action plan, and have a look. You know, women's organizations especially at the local level are on the ground, and so they are the authorities on this. And the one thing that we need to do better, I was listening to a report on Ukraine, and they are documenting not just on women's peace and security, but everything that's happening is being documented very carefully, because they've looked at other conflicts and they've understood that after a conflict, sometimes people's memories are different. They've lost photographs, they've lost evidence. And so during a conflict, if you can collect evidence, if you can collect data that shows that women peace and security agenda is failing, then it may not be timely to do anything about it right now, but it will contribute to the overall actions to make sure that it's implemented at the right time.
Yes, I agree. The journey of 1,000 miles starts with a step. It's actually, speaking of also the challenges that we tackled in the first section of our session, let's go back maybe to the link between the gender equality and sustainable peace, which we believe is well documented. Yet traditional power dynamics and cultural norms often impede progress. What do you think are the most effective strategies you have seen, or you have actually maybe contributed to apply for challenging these dynamics in patriarchal societies? I mean,
yeah, it's
how the challenge, maybe now we can suggest some, let's say, maybe general strategies for overcoming this.
yeah, and I think you have to take it out of the conflict or peace and security realm, and I'm not trying to make it fit in there, because we're talking about societies which are generally patriarchal. And so thinking about strategies, how do you get recognition, how do you get economic power, and how do you make sure that women have the ability to speak up and act up. We work with a civil society organization in Libya that had trainings for women to learn how to fix mobile phones. And they got a small amount of funding. And it may seem like a silly thing, but it gave women in a very small community a skill set that they could sell, that they could market. At this NGO, they also had a psychologist on hand. And the psychologist was there in case any of the women were victims of domestic violence and wanted a safe place to speak about it. Now, if they had told their husbands or their fathers or their brothers that they were going to this NGO and they were going to have a discussion on gender-based violence, you know they wouldn't be allowed there. But if they told their husbands and fathers and sons that they were going to learn how to fix mobile phones, that was something that they were allowed to do. So it starts with the smaller things, but making sure that women have the skills to be able to speak up and to have some independence. Because the problem is breaking the patriarchy requires women to have the ability to stand on their own. And not just in the Middle East, but it's still in many non-Middle East countries. Women don't have the economic resources. They don't have their own income. They don't have their own networks. And so this NGO was not only teaching them a skill that they could sell, but they were also helping create networks. And, you know, women were meeting women in similar circumstances. So that's one side of it. You can't smash the patriarchy until women are able to live with the consequences of being alone, or not alone, because we all have support. And the other side is, again, I don't think all men are intentionally patriarchal. And we have when we work with women in parliaments, for instance, we ask them to point out behaviors to their male colleagues that are either discriminatory or harassing, you know, like in a committee meeting when men shushes women, or, you know, doesn't let them speak. And so we had these women point this out to their male colleagues, and they said, well, we don't do that. And this woman said, watch the next meeting and see how many times you tell someone it's not her turn, or we've all been in those meetings, right? And this was in Sweden. This wasn't in Baghdad. Yes, this was in Sweden.
Different context.
So in every person we have biases. And I always want to give people the opportunity to understand their biases and to say, you know, what you're doing is not okay. And with men and in patriarchal communities, it's like your daughters are not getting the opportunities your sons are getting. Is that okay? Is that really okay? And there was an organization in, I think it was Mosul, that went to the technical college and showed the head of the technical college that women's enrollment was really, really low compared to male enrollment. And so what they decided to do was have a separate enrollment for women, and enrollment went through the roof. And they just made it easier for women within the confines of their current cultural situation to be able to enroll and get the education that was available to boys. It wasn't not available to women. They just didn't make it a safe or an appropriate place for them to enroll. Sorry, I'm talking too long, I know.
No, it's actually, and you're bringing some of your experience, some of your observations, and also some of the specific stories which all the audience would like to hear. I think it gives more more reality, or it makes the thoughts that we are talking about more realistic. So no, I really appreciate that. So speaking maybe of the connection between the local movements, the local women movements with the global advocacy networks. I mean, we're starting from the challenge is about the exclusion and maybe isolation for women groups, moving to the opportunities, and now moving to the strategies. How do you think within the situation now, the status quo, that Syrian women, how can they build stronger local movements and connect these movements to the global advocacy network?
Well, I think it takes doing some homework, and thankfully with the availability of information, it's, it just takes going through different countries, different organizations, and figuring out which international organizations are interested in Syria, in women's peace and security, whatever it is you're talking about. Also, in the European Parliament, there are commissions. Find out who sits on commissions that are either related to Syria or directly have an interest. Who has on Twitter as a politician or the head of another network outside of Syria, who has mentioned Syria, who has talked about women's peace and security? Connect with them on LinkedIn, on Twitter, X or whatever it's called, or Facebook, and share stuff with them. It's not always about networking, as you know, Miriam, is a little give and take. And it's not the first connection is not what can you do for me and what can I do for you? It's about, oh, here's something of interest I thought you might like. And it's about building those relationships. And you can build those relationships with decision makers in national parliaments and in other parliaments like the European Union, in different commissions within the United Nations, and it's about understanding what motivates other people and what interests them. And then if they say, oh, here's this organization in Syria, I didn't know they existed, that's great. And look at the information they have and the activities they're doing, and they will follow you and connect with you, and then you can start building on that to create a network outside of Syria, but also within Syria.
Thank you. Thank you very much for answering this question. I have one last question, which is actually I was going to ask you since you have been working in the Balkans. And with this question, we wrap up our last part of the session. I will leave the floor later to the audience for a couple of comments and questions, and then we conclude the session for today. You mentioned the Dayton Peace Accord that was signed in 1995 in the Balkan, which ended the Bosnian War, of course. But this specific accord was criticized for excluding women from the negotiation table. Given the similarities in terms of deeply maybe divided societies and complex political dynamics in Syria, what lessons can we learn from this case to ensure that Syrian women are not sidelined in future peace talks?
20 years ago, and nobody raised, a lot of people did raise the issue that there were no women at the Dayton Peace Courts or negotiating, but I hope there would be louder voices if a similar incident happened right now. So your question was, how can women make
Yes,
sure this
what
doesn't happen
message
again?
or what lesson? Yeah, what lessons can we learn so Syrian women are not sidelined or excluded from the future peace talks that we hope is going to take place in Syria?
Well, I think we can make sure that we understand and leverage 1325 and its other sections and other resolutions, because there are much stronger voices now on including women in peace negotiations, and to look at examples as I have today in Bangsamoro. There are other examples. Liberia, when their conflict ended, had a very robust women's organization and network, and they ended up with a woman president, Sirleaf, at the end of the conflict. So I think it's, again, about using the network that you have, making it stronger, and making your voices heard internationally as well as locally. And then, so for instance, if there was a peace negotiation that happened for Syria and there were no or few women involved, make your voices heard about how terrible, and insist both within Syria and also internationally.
Yes. Thank you very much for this valuable insights, actually, because we believe we will have these talks one day. So we need to be prepared. Women in Syria need to be really educated about this process. So I will take an interesting question from my audience, our audience. It's related to, okay, so in case of Syria, which the country is literally divided in the absence of democracy, the de facto authorities, which is really a factual status now in Syria, including extremist dictatorships in different regions. With the absence of the parliament system or structure in Syria, what do you think that the substitute or alternative entity women can initiate or maybe establish to be able to play a parallel role to the parliament? Yes,
yeah,
what are your advices for the women to be more active, to be there, to be present?
Well, I think that, when thinking about, we had thought about this a few years ago when we thought that there might be a breakthrough in Libya, for instance. It's not just women who are excluded from the peace building negotiating process. Most people are excluded. You usually have a group of elite men making very important decisions for a transition and for the future of a country. And that's why I think we have to take peace process, peace building, and look at it as a process, because we should be, again, asking people in communities, what are your priorities? How has this conflict affected your community? What is your community dynamic in terms of going forward after the conflict? Or what do you want to see as part of the peace building process? So it's not just that we don't ask women, we don't ask most of the population, and then suddenly, oh, we've got peace, now we're going to have a parliament, this is what the parliament's going to look like, and oh, we're going to have elections. I think everyone in Bosnia understood that the elections were held way too quickly after the conflict, because it was just the people who participated in the conflict, created the conflict, ended up being elected in the parliament.
Yes.
So I think that women can take the initiative in local communities. And if you have a network that covers several communities, you can say, look, we hope that we are going to come to this point soon where we will start talking about peace and moving forward. So we are going to establish a process within our community, link it to other communities, link it to other networks, and start having town hall meetings. Start doing, if it's not safe to do it in person, do it online. Ask citizens, normal, average human beings, what they want for their community, without any judgment, without any, you know, and make sure you include women and men and disabled voices, and make sure that you can then say, we've engaged in this process, and this is what people from our communities want. So then you have the evidence, you have something to say, we want to be heard because all of these people have contributed to this. This is not just Miriam who's with this NGO and, you know, it's a great NGO, you do great work, but if there is some evidence that has been an inclusive process itself, then you have stronger voices.
Yes, I agree. Thank you very much for answering this question. Just maybe before we conclude and wrap up, I will see with my colleague Aras if there is someone who wants to ask a question, not written, I mean verbally. So فراس الله يعطيك العافية. أراس في حدا حابب يعمل مداخلة صوتية؟
كان في عندنا مداخلة سابقا مع فاطمة زيدان إذا متاحة لساتها الآنسة فاطمة زيدان أو الآنسة سناء الجاسم إذا معنا. طيب
يعطيكم العافية. أنا سناء
تفضل يا أنسة.
راح أدخل مداخلة.
تفضل.
أنا سناء راح أدخل مداخلة. هلا راح أحكي على 3 نقاط أساسية الصراحة. أول شغلة راح أحكي عن الصورة المغلوطة للمرأة العربية، إن كان بمجتمعنا تحاسب لأنها امرأة، وإن كان ببلاد المهجر أو الجوار تحاسب لأنها عربية مسلمة وتحاسب بذنب أخطاء الآخرين. وهذا الشيء ما نحن في عنا الطبيبات وعنا المهندسات وعنا العالمات، فهذا الشيء زرع الخوف بأن نحن نكون قياديات وناشطات في عملية بناء السلام. النقطة الثانية قلة البرامج والجهات اللي بتساعد بعملية بناء السلام. وحتى لو فرضنا إنه صار في هيك نوع من البرامج، كيف أنا بدي أقنع مجتمعي اللي عم بيعاني من صراعات ونزاعات، واللي كمان مناطق الجوار عم بيعانوا من نفس النزاعات والصراعات مثل غزة ولبنان، وكيف إنه الهيئات الدولية وأيضا المجتمع الدولي ما بيحسن يحاسب كل هالانتهاكات الإنسانية اللي عم بتصير. فأنا كيف بدي أقنع مجتمعي إنه ممكن هاي الاتفاقيات والمعاهدات اللي عم ننادي فيها بحقوق الإنسان إنه لا، في حق ممكن إنه يطالب فيه، وإنه لنا أدوارنا الحقيقية في عملية التغيير. أنا عم بحكي كناشطة مدنية طبعا، صار لي 7 سنوات في مجال التطوع. والأمر الأخير اللي بدي أحكي عنه هو الوضع الاقتصادي للمنطقة. كثير من النساء أنا بعرفهم، زميلاتي وصديقاتي، كانوا طموحات ومدركات لأهمية أدوارهم الحقيقية، ولكن فرضت عليهم المسؤوليات نتيجة فقدان للمعيل، إن كان الزوج أو الأخ، أو نتيجة اعتقاله، اختفائه، نتيجة إصابته الحربية أو استشهاده. فهون قبلت بمسؤوليات جديدة فرضت عليها، فكان لازم تتخلى عن طموحاتها لحتى تقدر تعيل أسرتها بأبسط الاحتياجات في النزاعات والصراعات اللي نحن هلا عم نعاني فيها الداخلية. فسؤالي اللي بيطرحه لحضراتكم، أنا كسيدة موجودة بالداخل بالشمال، كيف بدي أساعد وأعين وأقدم هاي الخدمة وهذا الوعي وهذا البناء السلام، وأنا عندي كل هالنقاط وهالثغرات الكبيرة اللي أنا عم بحاول إني أرممها، ولكن يد واحدة لا تصفق. فشو هي المجالات اللي ممكن نحن نتدخل فيها ونغير ونساعد لحتى النساء تاخذ أدوارها بظل هاي الظروف وهي الصور اللي نحن الصراحة عم نشوفها، إن كان بالنساء بالداخل أو حتى النساء الموجودين في الخارج اللي عم بيسعوا ويساعدوا لحتى يساعدونا نحن النساء الموجودين في الداخل، ولكن كمان هن عم بيعانوا من ضغوطات كبيرة ويحاسبوا بذنب آخرين هن ما كان لهم فيها بهي الآلام وبهي المعاناة الحقيقية اللي عم نعانيها. وبعتذر إذا أطلت عليكم. تحياتي
لا
للجميع.
الله يعطيك العافية، بس خليكي معي ثانية سناء من بعد إذنك. السؤال هو عن المجالات اللي يمكن نساعد فيها بوصفنا مين، يعني من نحن. السؤال موجه للمجتمع الدولي، موجه لرأي الضيف، موجه لمين تحديدا؟
عزيزتي، أنا بوجه النداء لكل النساء الناشطات الموجودات في الخارج، الهيئات الدولية اللي عم بتطالب بأدوار النساء العربيات، وهن بالأساس لما بتطلع مرأة عربية تهجم وتحاسب بذنوب أخطاء آخرين. يعني حتى هي بنعانيها بمجتمعنا، الخطأ يحاسب ويعمم على الجميع، ولكن عمل والصواب والعمل الإنساني الحقيقي لا يرى. فهذا الشيء يعني كتير أثر علينا وعلى ثقتنا بأن نحن نكون سيدات قادرات على أن نعمل عملية التغيير في ظل هذه الظروف الصعبة.
مشكورة، يعطيك ألف عافية. رح أحاول أكيد لخص النقاط اللي طرحتيها رغم أنه هي جدا مهمة، بس ولكن لطول بعض الشيء ولضيق الوقت التبقي أساسا قربنا ننتهي، فرح أحاول ألخص النقاط لضيفتي. شكرا لك. So Francesca, Sana has posed an important question, but I need to illustrate maybe or elaborate on 3 points before we ask you this question. There is, based on her contribution to this question, there's wrong stereotype or wrong image maybe, or stereotyping for Arabic women, for Arab women, which is influencing in a bad way their ability and their self-confidence to be more active in civil society activities, and to be more actors, active actors in the peace-building process. There's also the absence of holding the killers and the violations, who do the violations, accountable. So in this case, how she asks, how can you convince the civil society where she lives in Syria, in northwest Syria, how can she convince the community where she lives in that these peace building processes are really of value, and they will result in something really important and applicable. Her last question or point is about the economic situation in the area, in the region, in general, which really left lots of women without breadwinners, and this put more constraints on women responsibilities and roles. So this caused the hindering and hampering of their ambitious and their time to be more active in social activism, in political activism. Her question following these points is how, as women activists, as international NGOs, as UN agencies can intervene to help women to become more active in the peace building process and in political transition.
Wow, a lot of really good points there, and I wish we had a lot more time to discuss them. Just in terms of, as I said earlier, women have the skills, and I know that our society makes our self-esteem low. Stereotypes prevent us from believing in ourselves and for others believing in us. And if you want to convince someone of the benefits of being involved in peacekeeping, maybe that's too big for now, but convince them of the benefits of you participating in your community to make sure that children are safe, that kids can go to school. It all depends on your own situation in your community and with yourself. But there is power in numbers, and support from other women's organizations, support from others in the community is so important. And so even women have their stereotypes of women, still negative stereotypes all over the world. And that's something that we have to just keep fighting in terms of, by example, by who we are, what we do. My cousin put on his Facebook a picture of his granddaughter the other day and said, "Isn't my granddaughter beautiful?" And I wanted to say, is she smart too? Like, that's the first thing you say? This is 2024. Anyway, but my point is that there's stereotypes everywhere, and we just need to do what we can do, what we are safe to do. In some communities, it's not safe. But we also need to surround ourselves and look for others who can support us and who we can support. Because once we have that, there is strength in numbers, and we need to get to a critical mass, and we need to work in our communities. And if it's not peace building, then work on other community issues, because all of these issues will contribute to the peace. So if someone's not convinced yet that they want to be involved in peace or that they are capable of it, You're certainly capable as a community of making sure you have clean water, making sure that there's enough assistance for women who don't have economic empowerment yet.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
That's the short answer.
No, I think it's a complex question. It summarized the whole situation in the region. So I think it needs hours and hours to be answered. Thank you very much, Francisca. Just before we conclude, what would be your key message to Syrian women striving to amplify their voices and to contribute meaningfully to building a peaceful and inclusive Syria?
I am so in awe and impressed with the work that you do, women activists, and not just activists, but women in conflict communities and how they keep it together. And so my main piece of advice is don't be discouraged, and just understand that you're going to have really good days, you're going to have really bad days, and just be safe, do it safely, and broaden your network. And with digital media, look for like-minded people outside of Syria who can support you. Like anything I see from anyone, I like to amplify. So if, do that times 100. Look for people on Twitter or Instagram who have mentioned Syria, who have mentioned women in peace, and then connect with them digitally. But my biggest piece of advice right now is be safe and just continue doing the kick-ass job you're doing.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Francisca. Now, as we wrap up, I really want to express our deepest gratitude for sharing your wealth of knowledge with us, your experience. Your insights have been really invaluable, shedding lights on all these complexities of women's participation in peace building and inspiring us actually to continue pushing for inclusive processes. Thank you for your time, your thoughtful contributions, and your strong commitment to empowering women in conflict and post-conflict contexts. It has been an honor to have you with us today.
It's been my honor. Shukran.
Shukran. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.